The shotgun blast echoed across the dusty plains of Montana Territory. 1878, startling Francesca Thornhill from her restless slumber. She bolted upright in her small homestead bed, her long auburn hair tumbling wildly around her shoulders as another shot rang out, followed by the unmistakable sound of men shouting. Through the window, the orange glow of flames licked at the night sky. Her barn was burning. Francesca scrambled from her bed, heart pounding against her ribs as she hastily pulled on her dress. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, circling her small cabin like wolves around prey. She reached for the rifle her father had left her, but the door splintered inward before her fingers could close around the cool metal. 3 men burst into her home, faces partially obscured by bandanas, eyes gleaming with malice in the dim lamplight. The tallest among them stepped forward, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Miss Thornhill, you've been given ample warning. This land belongs to the Western Rail Company now." "This is my father's land," Francesca countered, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have the deed and I'm not selling, not now, not ever." The man chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Your stubbornness has cost you your barn. Next time it'll be this cabin with you in it." He nodded to his companions. "Take her. Mr. Harrison wants a word." Before Francesca could react, rough hands seized her arms. She fought, kicking and screaming, but a rag was pressed against her face, smelling of something sharp and chemical. The world tilted and swam before her eyes, darkness creeping in from the edges of her vision until consciousness slipped away entirely. When Francesca awoke, her head throbbed mercilessly, and the ground beneath her swayed with a steady rhythm. She blinked against harsh morning sunlight, slowly registering that she was lying in the bed of a wagon, her wrists bound before her. Panic surged through her veins as memories flooded back: the fire, the men, her home. "She's awake," a gruff voice announced. Francesca struggled to sit up, taking in her surroundings. The wagon was part of a small caravan heading west across open prairie. 2 men sat at the front of her wagon, while several others rode alongside on horseback. She recognized them as the men who had broken into her home. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, her throat raw and dry. The driver glanced back, his face weathered by sun and age. "To Miles City. Mr. Harrison is waiting." Harrison. The name sent ice through her veins. Jeremiah Harrison, owner of the Western Rail Company, who had been trying to buy her father's land since before his death 3 months ago. The land that controlled access to the only reliable water source for Miles' land that would be worth a fortune to the railroad. Francesca assessed her situation with growing dread. 5 men, all armed, taking her to Miles City, a 2-day journey. By the time anyone noticed her missing, she would be at Harrison's mercy, and her father's land would be vulnerable. She had to escape, but the ropes around her wrists were tight, and the men watched her carefully. As the wagon crested a small rise, Francesca noticed a lone rider approaching from the southeast, moving parallel to their route. The men in the caravan had spotted him too, hands moving instinctively to their weapons. "Who is that?" one of them called out. The driver squinted against the sun. "Probably just a drifter. Pay him no mind unless he comes closer." But the rider did come closer, angling his horse toward the caravan with deliberate intent. As the distance between them shortened, Francesca could make out a tall man atop a magnificent black stallion. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring his features, but there was something in his posture that suggested confidence, even as he approached a group of armed men alone. "That's far enough, stranger," one of the men called out, raising his rifle slightly. The rider halted his horse about 20 yards away, lifting his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "Morning, gentlemen," he called, his voice carrying across the distance with a rich, deep timbre. "Fine day for traveling. State your business," the driver demanded. "Just passing through," the stranger replied easily. "Heading to Miles City myself. Thought I might join your caravan if you're headed that way, safer to travel in numbers." The men exchanged glances, clearly suspicious. The leader, a man Francesca had heard called Reeves, rode forward slightly. "We ain't looking for company, mister. Best you be on your way." The stranger didn't move. "That's a shame." His gaze shifted to Francesca, taking in her bound wrists and disheveled appearance. Something flickered in his eyes, concern, perhaps, or determination. "Especially since it appears the lady might appreciate some alternative companionship." Reeves's hand moved to his holster. "This ain't your concern, cowboy. Ride on while you still can." The stranger seemed to consider this, his head tilting slightly as he studied the group. Francesca held her breath, both hoping he would leave for his own safety and desperately wishing he would somehow help her. "You know," the stranger said conversationally, "my ma always taught me that a gentleman should never ignore a lady in distress." He shifted in his saddle, and Francesca noticed how his coat fell open slightly, revealing a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. The revelation sent a ripple of tension through the caravan. Reeves's face darkened as he recognized the badge. "You're out of your jurisdiction, lawman." "Marshal Yorke Jenkins," the stranger corrected, touching the brim of his hat. "And a U.S. Marshal's jurisdiction is wherever he happens to be." His easy smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained hard as flint. "Now, how about you untie the lady and explain why you're transporting a bound woman across territorial lands?" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Francesca counted 5 men against 1 Marshal, terrible odds by any measure. She tensed, preparing for the violence she felt certain would erupt. Instead, Reeves forced a laugh. "There's been a misunderstanding, Marshal. Miss Thornhill here is being transported to Miles City on Mr. Harrison's orders after attempting to burn down her own property to prevent foreclosure. We're simply ensuring she faces proper charges." Marshal Jenkins's expression didn't change. "Is that so?" His gaze met Francesca's. "Madam, would you care to give your version of events?" "They're lying," Francesca called out, her voice carrying despite her dry throat. "They burned my barn, kidnapped me from my own home. I own my land outright. Harrison has been trying to force me to sell." The marshal nodded as if this confirmed something he already suspected. "Well now, that does present us with a problem. Because kidnapping is a federal offense, and I take such matters quite seriously." Reeves spat on the ground. "It's 5 against 1, Marshal. Even with that badge, those odds don't favor you living to see sunset." "You might be right about that," Jenkins conceded, his hand still nowhere near his holster. "But I guarantee at least 3 of you would join me in that final sunset. Are you certain you want to test which 3? The threat hung in the air, and Francesca could see the calculation happening behind Reeves's eyes. The marshal didn't appear armed beyond the standard revolver at his hip, but there was something in his steady gaze that gave even hardened men pause. "Mr. Harrison won't take kindly to interference," Reeves warned. "Mr. Harrison is welcome to register his complaints at the federal courthouse," Jenkins replied evenly. "Now I'll ask once more politely, untie the woman." For several heartbeats no one moved. Then Reeves nodded curtly to one of his men, who reluctantly climbed into the wagon and cut Francesca's bindings. As the ropes fell away, she rubbed her chafed wrists, never taking her eyes off the marshal who had appeared like an answered prayer on the empty prairie. "Miss Thornhill," Jenkins called, "if you'd care to join me, I'd be happy to escort you back to your property." Before Reeves could object, Jenkins guided his horse closer to the wagon. He extended a gloved hand toward Francesca, his expression gentle but urgent. She understood immediately this window of opportunity might close at any moment. Gathering her courage, Francesca rose to her feet in the swaying wagon bed. The men watched, tense and uncertain, as she moved to the edge. Marshal Jenkins positioned his horse alongside, his hand still outstretched. "It's now or never, Miss Thornhill," he said softly. Francesca looked into his eyes. They were a startling blue against his sun-bronzed skin, and made her decision. With a deep breath, she leaped from the wagon toward him, feeling his strong arm catch her around the waist and pull her up onto the saddle before him. "Hold tight," he murmured against her ear. And then they were off, his stallion responding instantly to his command, thundering across the prairie away from the caravan. Behind them, Francesca heard shouts and the report of a rifle, but Jenkins kept them low in the saddle, zigzagging unpredictably as they put distance between themselves and her captors. His arm remained secure around her waist, his body solid and reassuring against her back as the powerful horse carried them swiftly away. "They're following," Francesca called over the wind rushing past them. "Not for long," Jenkins replied with calm confidence, guiding his horse toward a line of cottonwoods that marked a creek bed in the distance. "Thunder here can outrun anything on four legs in the territory." True to his word, by the time they reached the shelter of the trees, their pursuers had fallen well behind, becoming small dots on the horizon before disappearing altogether. Only then did Jenkins slow their pace, allowing his horse to pick its way more carefully along the creek. "Are you hurt, Miss Thornhill?" he asked, his voice gentle with concern. Francesca took stock of herself: bruised wrists, a throbbing head, and various aches from rough handling, but nothing serious. "I'll be fine," she answered, suddenly acutely aware of his proximity, of the strength in the arm still wrapped protectively around her. "How did you know? To come for me, I mean." Jenkins guided his horse to a stop beside the creek, allowing the animal to drink. With gentle hands, he helped Francesca dismount before swinging down himself. "I didn't know it would be you specifically," he admitted, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair and those remarkable blue eyes. "But I've been tracking Harrison's operations for months. There's been a pattern of intimidation against homesteaders who won't sell. When I heard rumors of plans to persuade a stubborn widow near Cottonwood Creek, I decided to investigate." "I'm not a widow," Francesca corrected automatically. "My father died 3 months ago. The land is mine now." Jenkins nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. "My apologies for the assumption, Miss Thornhill." He extended his hand formally. "Yorke Jenkins, at your service." Francesca took his hand, noting the calluses that spoke of a life of hard work before he pinned on that marshal's badge. "Francesca Thornhill, and I owe you my life, Marshal Jenkins." "Yorke, please," he said, releasing her hand. "And you don't owe me anything. Keeping folks safe from men like Harrison is precisely what I'm sworn to do." He glanced at the sky, gauging the sun's position. "We should keep moving. It's not safe to linger, and we need to put more distance between us and Harrison's men." "You're taking me home?" Francesca asked, hope rising in her chest. Yorke's expression turned troubled. "I don't think that's wise, not immediately. Harrison's men will be watching your property. I need to get you somewhere safe while I gather evidence against Harrison." He hesitated. "I have a friend with a ranch about half a day's ride from here. We can shelter there while I send word to the territorial governor about what's happening." Disappointment and understanding warred within Francesca. She wanted desperately to return home, to ensure what remained of her property was protected, but she recognized the logic in his words. "Very well," she agreed reluctantly. "But I want your word that we'll return to my land as soon as possible, Everything my father worked for is there." "You have it," Yorke promised, his gaze steady and sincere. He offered her his canteen. "Drink. It's a long ride ahead." As Francesca accepted the water, their fingers brushed, sending an unexpected tingle up her arm. She attributed it to nerves, to the aftermath of danger, but couldn't deny the strange flutter in her stomach as she watched him check his horse's saddle with efficient movements. Marshal Yorke Jenkins was unlike any man she'd encountered in the Montana Territory, controlled yet kind, dangerous yet gentle. And as he helped her back onto his horse, seating himself behind her with respectful distance despite the necessary proximity, Francesca found herself grateful for more than just the rescue. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the rhythmic motion of the horse and the warm presence at her back gradually easing the tension from Francesca's body. The vast Montana landscape stretched around them, rolling prairie giving way to more rugged terrain as Yorke guided them southwest. "Your father's land," Yorke said eventually, breaking the silence. "What makes it so valuable that Harrison would resort to kidnapping?" Francesca appreciated that he didn't question her right to the land or suggest she should have sold. "It controls access to Crystal Creek, the only year-round water source for miles. My father knew the railroad would come eventually, so he homesteaded strategically. The most practical route for the tracks requires crossing our land, and any cattle operation in the region needs access to that water." Yorke nodded thoughtfully. "Smart man, your father." "He was," Francesca agreed, swallowing against the sudden tightness in her throat. "Samuel Thornhill. He came west after the war, built everything from nothing." She straightened her shoulders. "I won't dishonor his memory by surrendering what he created." "Admirable loyalty," Yorke commented, his voice warm with what sounded like genuine respect. "Though Harrison clearly underestimated what he was up against in you, Miss Thornhill." "Francesca, please," she corrected, glancing back over her shoulder to catch a glimpse of his expression. "And most men underestimate me, Marshal. I've grown quite accustomed to it." A smile touched his lips. "I suspect that's their last mistake in dealing with you." The observation, delivered with a touch of admiration rather than condescension, warmed something inside her. Since her father's death, Francesca had faced a constant barrage of unwanted advice, thinly veiled propositions disguised as offers of protection, and outright demands that she sell the land and move somewhere more suitable for a woman alone. To be taken seriously, even by this stranger, felt like drawing a full breath after months of suffocation. "What about you, Marshal?" she asked, curious about the man who had appeared so fortuitously in her life. "What brings a U.S. Marshal to this particular corner of the territory, beyond rumors of Harrison's misdeeds?" Yorke was quiet for a moment, and Francesca wondered if she'd overstepped. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing more than just facts. "I was born in Texas, raised on a small ranch until railroad men like Harrison burned us out when I was 16. My father died defending our home." His words were matter of fact, but Francesca felt the tension in his body behind her. "I spent some years drifting, took the badge about 8 years ago. When I started hearing about Harrison's methods in Montana Territory, I requested the assignment." "I'm sorry about your father," Francesca said softly, understanding now the personal nature of his pursuit. "It was a long time ago," Yorke replied, though something in his tone suggested the wound hadn't fully healed. "But it taught me that men like Harrison only understand one thing: the law applied with unwavering resolve. That's what I intend to give him." They crested a ridge, and Yorke pointed toward a distant plume of smoke rising from a valley about 2 miles ahead. "That's Daniel Freeman's place. He's a good man, Fought with your father in the war. He'll shelter us." As they approached the Freeman Ranch, Francesca found herself reluctant for the journey to end. Despite the circumstances, there was something compelling about the strong, principled man behind her, something that made her feel both protected and respected, a rare combination in her experience. The ranch came into view, a sturdy main house, bunkhouse, barn, and corrals spreading across a verdant valley. Several cowboys paused in their work to watch their approach, hands moving casually to their sidearms until Yorke raised his hand in greeting. A tall man with a silver-streaked beard emerged from the main house, squinting against the afternoon sun. Recognition dawned on his weathered face as they drew closer. "Yorke Jenkins, as I live and breathe," he called out. "What brings you to my doorstep?" His gaze shifted to Francesca, curiosity replacing his smile. "And with a lady, no less." Yorke dismounted smoothly before helping Francesca down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "Daniel, we need your help. This is Francesca Thornhill, Samuel's daughter." Understanding immediately replaced Daniel Freeman's curiosity. "Samuel's girl, Lord above." He stepped forward, extending calloused hands to take Francesca's. "Your father was one of the finest men I ever knew. Come inside, both of you. Whatever trouble you're in, you're safe here." As they followed Daniel into the house, Yorke's hand rested lightly at the small of Francesca's back, a gesture of protection and reassurance that felt surprisingly natural. Despite the danger still looming, despite Harrison's men undoubtedly searching for them, Francesca felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's passing. The sense that she wasn't facing her battles entirely alone. Daniel Freeman's ranch house was warm and inviting, with polished wooden floors and simple, sturdy furniture. The smell of fresh baked bread permeated the air as a plump, gray-haired woman appeared from what must have been the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Martha," Daniel said, "we have guests in need of hospitality. Yorke Jenkins and Miss Francesca Thornhill, Samuel's daughter." Martha Freeman's kind face lit up with both welcome and concern. "Goodness gracious, child, you look like you've been through an ordeal. Come, sit down. I'll fetch you some tea and something to eat." Before Francesca could protest, she was ushered to a comfortable chair near the fireplace, a soft quilt tucked around her legs despite the mild day. The simple kindness nearly undid her composure, reminding her of all she'd endured in the past 24 hours. While Martha bustled about preparing refreshments, Yorke explained the situation to Daniel in low, serious tones. Francesca watched the older man's expression darken as he learned of Harrison's escalating tactics and her kidnapping. "That snake," Daniel muttered, shaking his head. "Samuel warned us all about him, said he'd stop at nothing to control the water rights in this territory." He looked at Francesca with compassion. "Your father was right to stand his ground, Miss Thornhill, and so are you. Please call me Francesca," she insisted. "And thank you for your kindness. I won't impose on you for long." "Nonsense," Martha declared, returning with a tray laden with tea, fresh bread, and preserves. "You'll stay as long as needed. Any daughter of Samuel Thornhill is family to us." Yorke accepted a cup of coffee from Martha with a grateful nod. "I need to send telegrams to the territorial governor and my superiors in Helena. Is your boy Jimmy still working as a relay rider?" Daniel nodded. "He can get your messages to the telegraph office in Billings by tomorrow noon." "Good," Yorke said, his expression determined. "And I'll need to borrow a horse to scout Miss Thornhill's property tonight. I need to assess the situation there." Francesca straightened. "I'm coming with you." 3 pairs of eyes turned to her in surprise, but she held Yorke's gaze steadily. "It's my home, Marshal. I need to see what's left of it." "It's too dangerous," Yorke countered, his brow furrowed with concern. "Harrison's men will be watching, possibly waiting for you to return." "All the more reason I should accompany you," Francesca insisted. "You don't know the property like I do. There are approaches they won't be watching, hiding places only I'm aware of." She set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Besides, I need to retrieve the deed and my father's journals. They contain records of all Harrison's threats and offers evidence you'll need." Yorke studied her, clearly weighing her determination against his desire to keep her safe. Daniel cleared his throat. "She's got her father's spirit, that's certain," he observed. "Samuel wouldn't have stayed behind either." Something like reluctant admiration flickered in Yorke's blue eyes. "We leave at dusk," he finally conceded. "But you follow my lead, and if I say we retreat, we retreat. No arguments." "Agreed, agreed," Francesca said, satisfied. She took a sip of tea to hide her small smile of triumph. Martha clucked her tongue. "Before anyone goes anywhere, you both need rest and a proper meal. And Miss Francesca, I've a dress that might fit you better than those rumpled clothes." She cast an appraising eye over Francesca's disheveled appearance. "And a hot bath would do wonders, I imagine." The prospect of clean clothes and a bath was too tempting to refuse. After finishing her tea, Francesca allowed Martha to lead her to a small bedroom off the main hall, where the older woman efficiently prepared a bath behind a screen. "I'll lay out a fresh dress for you, dear," Martha said kindly. "Rest as long as you need. You're safe here." Left alone, Francesca sank gratefully into the warm water, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability now that no one could see. The events of the past day crashed over her: the terror of the attack, the helplessness of captivity, the exhilarating escape with Yorke. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, a release of tension more than sorrow. As she washed away the dust and fear, Francesca's thoughts kept returning to Marshal Jenkins. There was something compelling about him beyond his timely rescue and integrity that radiated from him, a sense of justice tempered with compassion. She recalled the feel of his arm around her waist as they rode, strong and secure without being possessive. Francesca shook her head at her own fanciful thoughts. The man was simply doing his job, pursuing a criminal who happened to be targeting her land. Any gratitude she felt was natural, as was her admiration for his courage. Nothing more. Yet when she emerged from her bath and dressed in the simple but clean gingham dress Martha had provided, Francesca found herself taking extra care with her appearance, pinning her auburn hair more neatly than necessary for a scouting mission to her ravaged homestead. By the time she rejoined the others in the main room, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Yorke had clearly used the time to refresh himself as well, his dark hair still damp from washing, his face cleanly shaved. He stood as she entered, his eyes widening slightly as they took in her transformed appearance. "Miss Thornhill," he acknowledged with a small nod, his voice holding a note she couldn't quite identify. "You look rested." "As do you, Marshal," she returned, noticing how his freshly laundered shirt strained slightly across his broad shoulders. Daniel interrupted their exchange by entering with a rolled map, which he spread across the table. "I've marked the best approach to your property, avoiding the main trails. If Harrison's men are watching, they'll expect you to come from the east." Yorke leaned over the map, his focus shifting immediately to the tactical situation. "We'll approach from the north, through Cottonwood Gulch. The tree cover should conceal our movements until we're within a quarter-mile of the house." For the next hour, they planned their approach, with Francesca providing detailed information about the layout of her property and potential hiding places for Harrison's men. Throughout the discussion, she was struck by how readily Yorke incorporated her suggestions, treating her as a partner rather than a burden to be protected. As dusk settled across the land, Daniel provided them with fresh horses, a sturdy buckskin for Yorke, and a nimble gray mare for Francesca. Martha pressed food parcels into their saddlebags and extracted a promise that they would return if there was any sign of serious danger. "Be careful, both of you," Daniel said gravely as they prepared to depart. "Harrison's not a man to cross lightly, and he's got half the county officials in his pocket." "Not for much longer," Yorke assured him, checking his revolver before sliding it back into its holster. "Once we have the evidence from Miss Thornhill's home, I'll have what I need to bring federal charges." With final farewells, they rode out into the gathering darkness, keeping to the shadows of the land as they made their way northeast toward Francesca's homestead. They rode in silence, both acutely aware of the need for stealth, communicating with gestures and shared glances rather than words. In the quiet of the night ride, with only the soft sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird for company, Francesca found herself studying Yorke's profile whenever the moonlight illuminated his features. There was a stillness to him, a contained power that suggested he was always aware, always ready. Yet there was gentleness, too, evident in how he handled his horse, in the considerate way he adjusted their pace to ensure she wasn't struggling to keep up. As they neared her property, Yorke signaled for them to dismount in a small copse of trees. They secured their horses and proceeded on foot, moving cautiously through the underbrush. When they reached the edge of the trees, Francesca's homestead came into view in the valley below, bathed in pale moonlight. The sight stole her breath. The barn was nothing but a blackened skeleton against the night sky. Her small cabin still stood, but the door hung askew on broken hinges, windows shattered. Even from this distance she could see that her garden had been trampled, the fence around it splintered and broken. Yorke's hand found hers in the darkness, a silent offering of strength. Francesca clutched it gratefully, fighting back the surge of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm her. "You see anyone?" she whispered, forcing herself to focus on the present danger rather than her losses. Yorke scanned the property with narrowed eyes. "Two men by what's left of the barn, another probably inside the house." He pointed to a faint light visible through one of the intact windows. "We need to be careful," Francesca nodded, collecting herself. "There's a root cellar behind the house. The entrance is hidden by a woodpile. We can access the house through the trapdoor in the pantry floor." Yorke's eyebrows rose in appreciation of this information. "Your father thought of everything, didn't he?" "He didn't trust easily," Francesca confirmed. "The war taught him to prepare for the worst." They worked their way around the perimeter of the property, using the contours of the land and the shadows of trees to avoid detection. When they reached the back of the house, Yorke held Francesca back with a gentle hand on her arm, his eyes scanning for any sign of guards. Seeing none, he nodded, and they darted quickly to the woodpile she had indicated. Working together in silent coordination, they shifted enough wood to reveal the slanted cellar doors beneath. Yorke eased one open just enough for them to slip inside, then closed it carefully behind them, replacing some of the wood to conceal their entry. The root cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and preserved vegetables. Yorke struck a match, its small flame illuminating their surroundings just enough to navigate toward the ladder that led up to the house. "I'll go first," he whispered, his face close to hers in the confined space. "If there's trouble, you run. Don't wait for me." Francesca shook her head. "We came together. We leave together." Something flickered in Yorke's eyes, respect, concern, and something warmer that made Francesca's heart beat faster. Before she could analyze it, He extinguished the match and began climbing the ladder toward the trapdoor above. With extreme care, Yorke lifted the trapdoor a fraction of an inch, peering into the pantry beyond. Finding it empty, he pushed it open fully and hauled himself up, then reached back to help Francesca. The familiar surroundings of her home, now in disarray, sent a pang through Francesca's heart. Shelves had been emptied, food stores scattered across the floor. They moved silently through the pantry into the main room of the cabin, where the devastation was even more pronounced. Furniture had been upended, her few precious books torn and strewn about, her mother's china shattered. Anger replaced sorrow as Francesca took in the deliberate destruction. This wasn't just intimidation, it was cruelty meant to break her spirit. A soft snore drew their attention to a figure slumped in her father's armchair, a bottle of her father's whiskey dangling from his limp fingers. One of Harrison's men, left to guard the property, now deep in drunken sleep. Yorke placed a finger to his lips, then gestured toward what had been her father's bedroom. Francesca nodded, leading the way. The bedroom had suffered the same treatment as the rest of the house, but Francesca went straight to the bed, kneeling to pry up a floorboard beneath it. From the hidden compartment, she withdrew a tin box and a leather-bound journal. "The deed and my father's records," she whispered, clutching them to her chest. "Everything we need." Yorke nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Is there anything else you need? We should leave before our sleeping friend wakes up or his companions return from their patrol." Francesca glanced around the room that had been her sanctuary since childhood. Everything of true value was either destroyed or in the box she now held, except for one thing. She moved to the small dresser, its drawers hanging open and emptied, and reached behind it to retrieve a small velvet pouch tucked into a gap in the wall boards. "My mother's locket," she explained softly. "The only thing I have of hers." Their task accomplished, they retraced their steps toward the pantry. As they passed through the main room, the guard stirred, mumbling something incoherent. Both froze, scarcely breathing, until he settled back into his alcohol-induced slumber. They had almost reached the pantry when the front door swung open, and two more of Harrison's men entered, their voices loud in the quiet night. "Johnson, wake up, you useless drunk," one called to the sleeping guard. "Boss wants us to burn what's left of this place by morning." Yorke reacted instantly, pushing Francesca toward the pantry. "Go," he hissed. "I'll be right behind you." The sudden movement caught the attention of the men at the door. "Hey, who's there?" What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion. Yorke drew his revolver as the men reached for their own weapons. Francesca darted into the pantry but couldn't bring herself to descend the ladder, unwilling to leave Yorke facing three men alone. Instead, she set down her precious box and pouch, then grabbed a cast iron skillet from among the scattered cookware. Peering around the pantry door, she saw Yorke facing off against the two men who had entered, while the previously sleeping guard was struggling to his feet, fumbling for his gun. Without hesitation, Francesca rushed forward and brought the skillet down hard on the guard's head. He crumpled back into the chair with a groan just as gunshots exploded in the small cabin. One of the men by the door fell, clutching his shoulder where Yorke's bullet had found its mark. The other fired wildly, his shot splintering the wood of the doorframe inches from Yorke's head. Yorke's second shot was more deliberate, striking the man's gun hand and sending his weapon clattering to the floor. The wounded man scrambled backward through the door, dragging his similarly incapacitated companion with him. "Francesca," Yorke turned to her, eyes wide with a mixture of relief and exasperation. "I told you to go." "You're welcome," she retorted, gesturing to the unconscious guard with her skillet. "Now we should both go before more arrive." A hint of a smile touched Yorke's lips despite the danger. "Remind me never to underestimate you, Miss Thornhill." They hurried back to the pantry, gathering her treasures before descending into the root cellar. Above them, they could hear shouting as more of Harrison's men responded to the gunfire. Moving as quickly as stealth allowed, they exited the cellar and raced for the cover of trees where they'd left their horses. Behind them, lanterns bobbed in the darkness as their pursuers spread out across the property, searching. They reached their mounts without being spotted and set off at a gallop, taking a different route back than the one they'd used to approach. Only when they were several miles away, with no sign of pursuit, did they slow to a more sustainable pace. In the silver light of the moon, Francesca could see Yorke watching her with an expression that mingled admiration with something deeper, more complex. "That was either the bravest or most foolhardy thing I've ever seen a civilian do," he said finally, his voice rough with lingering adrenaline. "Which do you think it was?" Francesca asked, suddenly needing to know his true assessment of her actions. Yorke studied her for a long moment before answering. "Both, and I'm grateful for it." He reached across the space between their horses to touch her hand briefly. "Thank you." The simple touch sent warmth cascading through Francesca, dispelling some of the night's chill. They rode on in companionable silence, the successful retrieval of the documents lending a sense of triumph to their journey despite the destruction of her home. As they approached the Freeman Ranch in the pre-dawn light, Francesca realized something had shifted between them during their dangerous expedition. A partnership had formed, forged in shared danger and mutual respect. And perhaps, she admitted to herself, something more, a spark of connection that had nothing to do with their circumstances and everything to do with the man himself. What began as a rescue was evolving into something neither of them had anticipated, something that made Francesca's heart beat faster whenever Yorke's blue eyes met hers across the space between them. The Freeman Ranch was stirring with early morning activity as they approached. Daniel himself was standing on the porch, rifle in hand, clearly having kept watch through the night. His tense posture relaxed visibly when he recognized them. "Thank the Lord," he called as they dismounted. "Martha's been worried sick." Yorke helped Francesca down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "We got what we came for," he told Daniel, nodding toward the tin box Francesca clutched, "and had a close encounter with some of Harrison's men." Daniel ushered them inside where Martha fussed over them, insisting they sit down to hot coffee and a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits while they recounted their night's adventure. When Francesca described how she'd felled the guard with a skillet, Martha clapped her hands in delight. "Samuel would be proud," she declared. "He always said you had your mother's beauty and his fighting spirit." After breakfast, Yorke and Daniel retreated to examine the documents Francesca had retrieved, while she allowed herself to be led away by Martha for some much-needed rest. Despite the excitement still humming through her veins, exhaustion claimed her almost as soon as her head touched the pillow. When Francesca awoke, the sun was already beginning its western descent. She found fresh clothes laid out, a simple but well-made dress that Martha must have altered while she slept, and quickly made herself presentable before seeking out the others. She found Yorke alone in the main room, seated at the table with her father's journal open before him, making notes on a separate sheet of paper. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting with a smile that quickened her pulse. "There you are," he said, rising to his feet. "We were starting to think you might sleep straight through to tomorrow." "How long was I asleep?" Francesca asked, embarrassed. "About 8 hours," Yorke replied. "Well deserved after our night's work." He pulled out a chair for her, and Francesca sat, noting the careful organization of papers spread across the table. "Have you found what you need in my father's records?" Yorke nodded, his expression turning serious. "Your father was methodical. He documented every interaction with Harrison, offers, threats, witnesses to conversations. Combined with the deed showing clear ownership, it's more than enough to bring charges." Relief washed through Francesca. "So it's over. Harrison will be arrested." "Not quite yet," Yorke cautioned. "I've sent telegrams with the evidence, but these things take time. And Harrison still has men watching your property, which means you're still in danger until he's in custody." Francesca absorbed this sobering reality. "What happens now?" "Daniel's boy rode out with my telegrams this morning. It could be days before we hear back and the proper warrants are issued." Yorke hesitated. "In the meantime, you're welcome to stay here with the Freemans where it's safe." "And you?" Francesca asked, suddenly afraid he would leave now that he had the evidence he needed. The thought of him riding away created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. Yorke's eyes held her steadily. "I'll stay until I know you're safe, Miss Thornhill. That's a promise." The sincerity in his voice warmed her from within. "Francesca," she reminded him softly, "after all we've been through, I think we're well past formalities, don't you?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Francesca," he agreed, her name sounding different, special somehow, in his deep voice. They were interrupted by Daniel and Martha returning from the barn, bringing with them the comfortable domestic routine of the ranch. As the evening progressed, Francesca found herself increasingly aware of Yorke's presence, the timbre of his laugh as he shared stories with Daniel, the gentle consideration he showed Martha, the warmth in his eyes whenever they met hers across the room. After dinner, as Martha cleared the dishes with Francesca's help, Daniel brought out a fiddle. "How about some music to lighten our spirits?" he suggested. "It's been too long since these walls heard a proper tune." To Francesca's surprise, Yorke accepted the instrument with familiar ease. "It's been a while," he warned, testing the strings and making small adjustments to the tuning. When he began to play, however, any reservations vanished. The sweet, mournful notes of a folk melody filled the room, his fingers moving across the strings with practiced skill. Francesca watched, entranced by this new dimension of the man she thought she was beginning to know. As the melody shifted to something more lively, Daniel pulled Martha into the center of the room, clearing space for an impromptu dance. The older couple moved together with the easy familiarity of decades shared, their faces alight with simple joy. When the tune ended, Yorke's eyes found Francesca, a question in them. Without a word, he began another melody, slower and more tender. Setting the fiddle aside, he rose and extended his hand to her. "May I have this dance?" he asked quietly. Heart fluttering, Francesca placed her hand in his. "I should warn you, I'm not particularly skilled at dancing." "Neither am I," Yorke admitted with a small smile. "We can be unskilled together." He drew her into his arms, one hand resting lightly at her waist, the other holding hers with gentle strength. They moved together in the small space, finding a shared rhythm that belied their claims of inexperience. Daniel hummed the melody Yorke had begun, providing music for their dance. As they turned slowly, Francesca became acutely aware of every point of contact between them, his hand at her waist, the solid warmth of his chest near hers, the way his breath stirred the hair at her temple. Dancing had never felt so intimate, so charged with unspoken meaning. "Thank you," Yorke said softly, his voice for her ears alone. "For what?" Francesca asked, looking up to find his blue eyes intent on her face. "For your courage, for trusting me." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Few women would have faced what you have with such strength." Few lawmen would risk everything for a stranger's property rights, she countered. You could have looked the other way. Many would have. Yorke's expression turned serious. Not when it matters, not when it's right. He hesitated, then added more quietly, "And you stopped being just a stranger to me the moment you jumped to my horse, Francesca." The way he said her name, with a gentleness that contrasted with his strong exterior, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. Their dance slowed until they were barely moving, just swaying together in the warm lamplight. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses outside. Instantly, Yorke's demeanor changed, his body tensing as he released Francesca and moved toward the window. Daniel reached for his rifle, but Yorke held up a hand. "It's all right. I recognize the lead rider. It's Deputy Marshal Collins from Helena." Relief and disappointment mingled in Francesca's chest. Relief that help had arrived so quickly, disappointment that their peaceful interlude had ended. She watched as Yorke strode outside to greet his colleagues, his posture once again that of the U.S. Marshal, rather than the man who had held her so tenderly moments before. 4 riders dismounted in the yard, exchanging handshakes with Yorke. Through the window, Francesca could see them engaged in serious conversation, Yorke gesturing occasionally toward the direction of her property. When they entered the house, Yorke made formal introductions. Deputy Marshal Thomas Collins was a weathered man with keen eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He nodded respectfully to Francesca. "Miss Thornhill, Marshal Jenkins speaks highly of your courage. I'm sorry for what you've endured." He removed his hat, revealing graying hair. "I've brought good news." Based on the evidence Marshal Jenkins telegraphed, the territorial judge has issued warrants for Jeremiah Harrison and 6 of his associates on charges of kidnapping, assault, destruction of property, and land fraud. A weight Francesca hadn't fully acknowledged lifted from her shoulders. "You can arrest them, all of them," Collins nodded. "We ride at first light to Miles City, where Harrison is currently staying according to our information. With your permission, we'd like you to accompany us to identify him and his men." Yorke stepped forward, concern evident in his expression. "Is that necessary, Tom? She's been through enough." "It's all right," Francesca assured him, straightening her shoulders. "I want to see Harrison face justice. I want to look him in the eye when it happens." Yorke studied her face, recognizing the determination there. After a moment, he nodded. "We'll all ride together then. Safety in numbers." The arrival of the deputy marshals transformed the quiet evening into a strategy session. Maps were spread across the table as they planned the approach to Miles City, discussing the likely locations where Harrison might be found and how to handle his men. Throughout the discussion, Francesca noticed Yorke positioning himself near her, almost protectively. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that their shared journey was approaching a conclusion, that soon the necessity binding them together would be resolved. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. Once Harrison was arrested and her property secured, what reason would Yorke have to remain in her life? He was a U.S. Marshal with duties that would take him elsewhere, pursuing other criminals, protecting other citizens. As the evening wore on and plans were finalized, the Freemans prepared sleeping arrangements for the deputies in the bunkhouse. When the others had retired, Francesca found herself alone with Yorke on the porch, the night sky ablaze with stars above them. "Are you afraid?" Yorke asked quietly, leaning against the porch railing beside her. Francesca considered the question honestly. "Not of Harrison or what happens tomorrow," she answered, "but after that's less certain." Yorke turned to face her, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "Your home can be rebuilt, Francesca. The land is still yours. You won't face that alone." Are you making promises on behalf of the U.S. Marshal Service Marshal Jenkins? She asked, attempting lightness despite the weight in her chest. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. No, he said softly, just me. Yorke, if you'll allow it. Francesca's heart quickened at the implication in his words. And what exactly are you promising, Yorke? Instead of answering with words, he raised a hand to her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek. The touch was questioning, giving her every opportunity to step away. When she didn't, his eyes darkened with an emotion that made her breath catch. Slowly, giving her time to refuse, Yorke lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss so tender it made her heart ache. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, becoming a promise more binding than any words could be. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Yorke rested his forehead against hers. I'm promising that whatever comes next, you won't face it alone, not if you don't want to. Francesca raised her hand to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. I don't want to, she whispered. Not anymore. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff and finding wings instead of falling, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. For so long, she had defined herself by her independence, by her ability to stand alone against the world. To acknowledge her desire for this man's presence in her life required a different kind of courage than facing Harrison's thugs. Yorke seemed to understand the magnitude of what she was offering, for he gathered her close again, his embrace both protective and reverent. Whatever happens tomorrow, he murmured against her hair, remember this moment. This is what's real. They remained on the porch until the chill of the night forced them inside, their conversation turning to quieter matters, childhood memories, dreams set aside, hopes cautiously rekindled. When they finally parted to seek their separate beds, something profound had shifted between them, a foundation laid for whatever might follow the coming day's confrontation. Dawn broke clear and cool across the Montana plains. The ranch was alive with activity as the marshals prepared for the ride to Miles City. Horses were saddled, weapons checked, final instructions exchanged. Francesca emerged from the house dressed in a riding outfit Martha had modified for her practical trousers, and a fitted jacket that allowed freedom of movement while still maintaining propriety. Her hair was neatly braided and pinned, her expression resolute as she approached the gathering of men. Yorke's eyes found her immediately, warming with approval and something more intimate that brought color to her cheeks. He crossed to her side, leading a horse not the borrowed mount from their previous excursion, but a beautiful chestnut mare with intelligent eyes. Daniel insisted you take Penny, he explained. Says she's the steadiest horse on the ranch and the fastest if need be. That's very generous, Francesca said, stroking the mare's velvet nose. I'll have to thank him properly. You already have, came Daniel's voice as he approached. By standing your ground against Harrison, men like him would swallow up everything good in this territory if left unchecked. He patted the horse affectionately. Penny will serve you well today and after if you've a mind to keep her. Before Francesca could protest such generosity, Martha appeared with bundles of food for their journey. The older woman embraced Francesca tightly. You come back to us when this is done, she insisted. Promise me. I promise, Francesca assured her, touched by the genuine concern. With final farewells exchanged, the party mounted and set off toward Miles City. Deputy Marshal Collins led the way, followed by his men, with Yorke and Francesca riding side by side at the rear. The formation was deliberate, protecting her, while keeping her from being immediately visible to anyone they might encounter. As they rode, Yorke briefed Francesca on what to expect. Harrison will likely be at the Cattlemen's Hotel. It's where he conducts most of his business when in town. We'll approach quietly, try to take him by surprise before his men can organize any resistance. And if there is resistance, Francesca asked, needing to be prepared for all possibilities. Yorke's expression turned grim. Then you stay behind me no matter what happens. My priority is your safety. The journey to Miles City took most of the day, the group maintaining a steady pace that conserved their horses' strength while covering ground efficiently. They spoke little, each focused on the confrontation ahead, though Francesca was acutely aware of Yorke's frequent glances in her direction, checking on her well-being. As the sun began its descent, the buildings of Miles City appeared on the horizon. The town had grown significantly since Francesca's last visit nearly a year ago, the influence of the coming railroad evident in new construction and increased activity. They approached from the west, avoiding the main road into town. At Collins's signal, they dismounted in a small grove of trees just outside the town limits. "We'll go in on foot from here," Collins instructed. "Less conspicuous that way. 2 of my men will circle around to the back of the hotel. Jenkins, you and I will take the front. Miss Thornhill, you'll stay with Deputy Wilson until we've secured the building." Yorke stepped closer to Francesca, his voice low. "If anything goes wrong, Wilson will get you to safety. Don't argue, don't wait for me. Promise me, Francesca." The intensity in his eyes made refusal impossible. "I promise," she said, though the words felt like stones in her throat. The thought of him facing danger while she retreated went against every instinct. Yorke seemed to read her thoughts. His hand found hers, squeezing gently. "This is what I do," he reminded her. "Trust me to do it well." With that, he turned to join Collins, checking his revolver one final time before they set off toward town. Deputy Wilson, a young man with kind eyes and a serious demeanor, positioned himself beside Francesca. "Don't worry, Miss Thornhill," he offered. "Marshal Jenkins is the best there is. If anyone can bring Harrison in without bloodshed, it's him." His words were meant to reassure, but they only heightened Francesca's awareness of the danger Yorke was walking into. Harrison was not a man who would surrender quietly, not when facing charges that would send him to prison for years. The minutes stretched interminably as they waited. The town sounds carried on the early evening air piano music from a saloon, the rumble of wagon wheels, distant laughter. Nothing to indicate that anything unusual was occurring at the Cattlemen's Hotel. Then, suddenly, shouting erupted, followed by the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Francesca stiffened, every instinct screaming at her to run toward the sound, toward Yorke. Deputy Wilson must have anticipated her reaction, for his hand closed firmly around her arm. "Stay here, Miss Thornhill," he insisted. Those were the marshal's orders. More shots rang out, then a brief, tense silence followed by another volley. Francesca's heart hammered in her chest, her imagination conjuring terrible images of Yorke injured or worse. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was somehow more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Minutes passed with no indication of what had happened. Deputy Wilson's grip on her arm relaxed slightly, his own concern evident in his tense posture. Finally, a figure emerged from the direction of the town, moving quickly toward them. As he drew closer, Francesca recognized one of Collins's deputies, and her heart sank when she realized it wasn't Yorke. "Wilson," the man called as he approached. "We need you." "There's been shooting." Harrison tried to flee. Collins and Jenkins pursued him to the livery stable. "What about Miss Thornhill?" Wilson asked, gesturing to Francesca. The deputy glanced at her, hesitation clear on his face. "Marshal Jenkins said to keep her safe, but we're outnumbered. Harrison's men are rallying." Before either man could stop her, Francesca stepped forward. "I'm coming with you," she declared, her tone brooking no argument. "I can help." The deputies exchanged glances, clearly torn between their orders and the practical reality of their situation. Finally, Wilson nodded. "Stay behind us, and if we tell you to run, you run." "Understood," Francesca agreed, relief flooding through her at not being left behind in ignorance. Together, they moved quickly toward town, keeping to shadows and side streets. The sounds of conflict grew louder as they approached the livery stable shouted commands, the occasional gunshot, the frightened whinnying of horses. They paused behind a nearby building, assessing the situation. Through gaps in the stable's wooden walls, Francesca could see movement inside, men taking cover behind stalls and hay bales, the flash of gunfire. "Harrison's holed up in the loft with 3 of his men," the deputy explained in a whisper. "Collins is pinned down near the entrance. Jenkins managed to work his way around to the back, but he's outnumbered." Francesca's gaze swept the area, her mind racing. Then she spotted a small side door to the stable, partially hidden by stacked crates. If she could reach it unseen, she might be able to create a distraction. Give Yorke and Collins the advantage they needed. Before the deputies could stop her, Francesca darted forward, keeping low and using the gathering dusk as cover. She heard Wilson's hissed command to stop, but ignored it, focused entirely on reaching that door without being spotted by Harrison's lookouts. Heart pounding, she pressed herself against the stable wall beside the door, listening. Inside, she could hear Harrison's voice, high and desperate. "Keep them pinned down. The horses are almost ready. Once it's fully dark, we ride out the back." Taking a deep breath, Francesca eased the door open just enough to slip inside. The stable was dimly lit by a few lanterns, casting long shadows among the stalls. From her position, she could see Collins and 1 deputy sheltering behind overturned feed barrels near the main entrance. Of Yorke, there was no sign, though she assumed he must be somewhere toward the rear of the building. Above, in the hayloft that ran along one side of the stable, Harrison and his men had created a defensible position, giving them clear lines of fire toward both entrances. They were focused entirely on the lawmen, none of them looking in her direction. Moving silently from shadow to shadow, Francesca made her way deeper into the stable. The horses were agitated by the gunfire, several of them stamping nervously in their stalls. She approached one, a large black stallion whose stall was directly beneath the hayloft where Harrison had positioned himself. "Easy, boy," she whispered, stroking the horse's neck. An idea was forming, dangerous but potentially effective. If she could startle the horses into a frenzy, the confusion might give the marshals their opening. She was reaching for the stall latch when a hand closed over hers. Francesca nearly cried out in alarm before recognizing Yorke, his finger pressed to his lips in a signal for silence. Relief flooded through her at the sight of him unharmed, followed immediately by concern at the anger evident in his expression. "What are you doing here?" he demanded in the barest whisper. "I told you to stay back." "I'm helping," she whispered back, defiant despite the fear coursing through her. "I can create a distraction." For a moment, she thought he might forcibly remove her from the stable. Then his expression shifted, calculation replacing anger as he assessed her position beneath the hayloft. "What's your plan?" he asked after a tense moment. Quickly, Francesca outlined her idea. The stable had a large open area where horses could be groomed and saddled. If they could drive several agitated horses into that space, directly beneath where Harrison was positioned, the chaos might force him to reveal himself. Yorke considered it, then gave a short nod. "It could work. But you'll be exposed when you open the stalls." "Not if you provide covering fire," Francesca countered. "Draw their attention to the back entrance. I'll handle the horses." The conflict was plain on Yorke's face, professional assessment of a tactical advantage warring with personal concern for her safety. Finally, he reached a decision. "On my signal," he said. "When you hear me call out to Harrison, that's when you move, not before." His hand closed over hers, a brief, fierce pressure. "Be careful." With that, he melted back into the shadows, moving toward the rear of the stable. Francesca pressed herself against the wall beside the first stall, heart racing as she waited. Moments later, Yorke's voice rang out from the back of the stable. "Harrison, it's over. We have the building surrounded. Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands up." As expected, Harrison and his men turned their attention and their firearms toward the source of the voice. Gunfire erupted, splintering wood where Yorke had been moments before. Seizing her opportunity, Francesca darted forward, opening the first stall. The nervous horse needed little encouragement to burst free, especially when she slapped its flank sharply. Moving quickly, she released 2 more horses, then scattered a bucket of feed in the open area to keep them there. The plan worked better than she'd hoped. The panicked horses circled and neighed, creating exactly the distraction needed. Above, Harrison and his men were forced to stand to see what was happening below, momentarily exposing themselves. It was all the advantage the marshals needed. Collins and his deputy fired simultaneously from the front, while Yorke emerged from cover at the back. Caught in the crossfire, 2 of Harrison's men fell immediately. The third threw down his weapon, hands raised in surrender. Harrison himself, recognizing his defeat, made one desperate attempt to escape, lunging toward a ladder at the far end of the loft. Yorke anticipated the move, positioning himself at the bottom of the ladder, gun trained upward. "It's finished, Harrison," he called. "Come down slowly, hands where I can see them." For a moment, it seemed Harrison might choose a suicidal last stand. Then, with a curse that echoed through the stable, he dropped his weapon and descended the ladder, his face twisted with rage and defeat. As Collins moved in to secure Harrison, Yorke crossed quickly to where Francesca stood among the still agitated horses, his expression a complex mixture of relief, admiration, and residual anger. "That," he said, taking her by the shoulders, "was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever witnessed. I haven't decided which." Before she could defend her actions, he pulled her against him in a fierce embrace, his heart pounding against hers. "Don't ever scare me like that again," he murmured into her hair. Francesca returned his embrace, the reality of what had just occurred and what might have happened washing over her in a delayed wave of fear and relief. "I couldn't stay behind," she admitted. "Not when you were in danger." Yorke drew back just enough to look into her face, his eyes intense. Whatever he might have said was interrupted by Collins approaching, a subdued Harrison in tow, hands bound behind his back. "Miss Thornhill," Collins acknowledged with a nod that contained both disapproval and reluctant respect. "It seems we owe you our thanks, though I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that civilian interference in law enforcement operations is generally discouraged." Harrison's gaze fixed on Francesca, recognition and hatred flaring in his eyes. "You," he spat. "This is your doing, you stubborn woman. That worthless piece of land isn't worth what it's cost me." "It was never about the value to you," Francesca replied calmly. "It was about what's right. My father built that homestead from nothing, and no amount of money or intimidation could make me dishonor his memory by selling to a man like you." Harrison lunged toward her, but was immediately restrained by Collins and another deputy. "Get him out of here," Collins ordered. "The jail will hold him until the circuit judge arrives next week." As Harrison was led away, still hurling threats and curses, Yorke kept his arm protectively around Francesca's waist. "Are you all right?" he asked when they were alone again. Francesca nodded, the full impact of the day's events finally hitting her. Harrison was captured. The threat to her land was over. Justice would be served. She felt suddenly light-headed with relief and exhaustion. Yorke seemed to sense her fatigue, for he guided her gently toward a hay bale, encouraging her to sit. "It's over, Francesca," he said softly. "You've won. Your land is safe." The simple statement brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She had been fighting for so long, first alongside her father against Harrison's initial offers, then alone after his death. To have finally prevailed, to know that her father's legacy was secure, released something tightly wounded within her. Yorke knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "You should know," he said, his voice carrying a note of hesitation she hadn't heard before, "that I've been offered a permanent posting in Helena. The territorial governor was impressed by the evidence we gathered against Harrison. He wants someone trustworthy overseeing this region as the railroad expands." Francesca felt her heart sink despite the victory they'd just achieved. Helena was a considerable distance from her homestead, too far for anything but occasional visits. "That's a wonderful opportunity," she managed, forcing a smile. "You deserve the recognition." Yorke's thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "I haven't accepted yet," he said, watching her face carefully. "I wanted to discuss it with you first." Hope flickered within her. "With me? Why?" "Because what I decide affects more than just my future now." His gaze held hers steadily. "At least I hope it does." Understanding dawned slowly, along with a warming joy that spread through her chest. "Yorke, are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've spent my life moving from one place to another, one assignment to the next, never putting down roots." He shifted closer, still holding her hands. "But these past days with you have shown me what I've been missing. For the first time, I'm thinking about a future that includes more than just the next criminal to chase." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing something small that glinted in the lantern light. "I bought this in town yesterday, before all this happened. It's not much, certainly not what you deserve, but—" In his palm lay a simple gold band, unadorned but beautifully crafted. Francesca's breath caught in her throat as he continued. "I know it's fast. Too fast, probably. We've known each other barely a week." He smiled ruefully. "But when a woman jumps from a wagon onto your horse, then faces down kidnappers and land thieves without flinching, a man tends to recognize what he's found." Francesca's heart seemed to expand in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. "And what is it you think you've found, Marshal Jenkins?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything," he answered simply. "A partner, a home, a future worth building." His blue eyes searched hers. "If you'll have me." Joy bubbled up within her, spilling over in a laugh that was half sob. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, I'll have you, Yorke Jenkins." His answering smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always been meant to rest there. Yorke rose from his knees, drawing her up with him and into his arms. "I should warn you," he murmured against her temple, "that being married to a U.S. Marshal comes with certain risks. No more risks than being married to a stubborn homesteader who creates distractions with stampeding horses," Francesca countered, her arms tightening around his waist. Yorke laughed, the sound rich and free in a way she hadn't heard before. Then he lowered his head, capturing her lips in a kiss that sealed their commitment more definitively than any words could have. The future stretched before them, rebuilding her homestead, making it their home, Yorke serving as marshal while Francesca managed their land. There would be challenges, certainly, but they would face them together, their partnership forged in fire and tempered by shared purpose. As they left the stable hand in hand, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky above Miles City, Francesca thought of how differently this day might have ended had Yorke not appeared beside that wagon 3 days ago. How one moment of courage, her desperate leap to his horse, had changed the course of both their lives. "What are you thinking?" Yorke asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Francesca smiled up at him, her heart full. "I'm thinking that sometimes the bravest jump a person can make isn't from a wagon to a horse," she said softly. "It's from solitude into love." Yorke's arm tightened around her shoulders, his kiss pressed to her hair a silent affirmation. Together they walked toward the future they would build, not just a homestead or a career, but a life shared, a love hard won in the wild heart of the Montana Territory. 20 years later, the homestead that had once been a small cabin and barn had transformed into a prosperous ranch. The Crystal Creek Ranch, as it was now known, boasted a handsome 2-story house, extensive outbuildings, and some of the finest cattle in the territory. Montana had achieved statehood, the railroad had come as predicted, and the small settlement near the Thornhill Jenkins property had grown into a proper town. On the wide porch of the main house, Francesca Jenkins stood watching the approach of 3 riders across the spring green pasture. Her auburn hair now held strands of silver, and fine lines marked the corners of her eyes, but the strength and determination that had defined her in youth had only matured with time. Beside her, Yorke's tall figure appeared, his dark hair similarly touched with gray at the temples. The years as both marshal and rancher had weathered his face, but his blue eyes remained as keen and warm as the day they'd met. "They're back," Francesca said, leaning slightly into her husband's solid presence. Yorke nodded, pride evident in his expression. "And from the looks of it, Samuel closed the deal with the army." Their eldest son, named for Francesca's father, rode at the front of the small group, his posture suggesting success in his mission to secure a contract supplying horses to the cavalry post 50 miles north. At 22, Samuel was the image of his father in build and bearing, though he had inherited Francesca's auburn hair and determined chin. Flanking him were his siblings, 19-year-old Margaret, as skilled a rider as any man on the ranch and possessing her mother's fearlessness, and 17-year-old Daniel, named for the friend who had provided shelter during those dangerous early days. "I still think you should have gone with them," Francesca said, slipping her arm through Yorke's. "Your reputation as marshal would have lent weight to the negotiations." Yorke smiled, covering her hand with his. "Former marshal," he corrected gently. "Besides, Samuel needs to establish himself on his own merits, and he has your business sense that's worth more than any badge." It was an old, comfortable discussion between them. Yorke had served as U.S. Marshal for 12 years before retiring to focus fully on the ranch and their growing family. His tenure had been marked by fairness and integrity, establishing law and justice in a region that had once been ruled by men like Harrison. Now, he was content to leave such responsibilities to younger men, including several he had trained personally. The riders drew closer, and now Francesca could see Samuel's broad smile. "They're successful," she confirmed, her own smile growing. "That contract will secure the ranch's prosperity for years to come." "As if there was any doubt," Yorke replied with a chuckle. "Between your land and my law enforcement, we've raised 3 children who could convince the devil to buy firewood." Francesca laughed, the sound still youthful despite the passing years. "I prefer to think they inherited our sense of justice and determination." "That too," Yorke agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple, a gesture that had become habitual over their 2 decades together, yet had lost none of its tenderness. As their children dismounted at the hitching post, calling greetings and eager to share their news, Francesca was struck by how fully her life had blossomed from that desperate moment, when she jumped from a kidnapper's wagon to an unknown marshal's horse. What had seemed like an ending her father's death, the attack on her home had instead been the beginning of something far richer than she could have imagined. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Jenkins," Yorke murmured, using the phrase that had become a familiar refrain between them. Francesca turned to him, taking in the beloved face that had been her constant through triumph and hardship alike. "I was just thinking," she said softly, "that some leaps of faith land exactly where they're meant to." Understanding lit Yorke's eyes as he drew her closer, his arm strong around her waist, the same strength that had caught her mid-jump 20 years before. "The best decision I ever made," he agreed, "was riding beside that wagon." As their children bounded up the porch steps, bringing with them the energy and promise of the future they had created together, Francesca and Yorke exchanged a look of shared gratitude. From a desperate escape to a life built on love and principle, their journey had been nothing like either had expected, but everything they had come to cherish. And it had all begun with one brave jump from a wagon to a horse, from danger to safety, from solitude to love, a leap that had landed exactly where it was meant to. In the arms of a future neither could have foreseen, but both had helped to build day by day, year by year, together.